We're not talking about
Good point.
Something isn't working right tonight, and I don't know why.
Well, the Y is in.
Hmm?
The Y is in.
Sorry?
Well, the Y is in fully.
Yeah. Everything's plugged in right. No. Well, this is working, but okay. Now I think we're working, finally. All right, so welcome to Genesis. Tonight, we pick up with the end of chapter 11, and we're going to hopefully make it all the way through chapter 15. So we begin with the Toledot of Terah, which is actually the story of Abram. And this begins to set up a pattern that we have in Genesis, where one Toledot will give a genealogy, and then the next Toledot will actually tell a story. And then the next Toledot will give a genealogy, and the next Toledot will tell a story. So we had the genealogy of Shem. Now this Toledot with Terah, we have the story of Abram. And remember that Toledot means like bringing forth or giving birth. And so it's about Terah's offspring, which centers, especially here, of course, on Abram. Let's go ahead and read verses 27 to 32. Blake, you want to read that for us?
Oh boy, we got good names. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah, in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, and she had no children. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran.
Okay, thanks for reading. So before we actually discuss a few things in this passage, I wanted to back up and just do a refresher of Genesis 1 through 11. We looked at it at the end of last week, kind of tracing the theme of the seed. But I'm going to step back and look at an even broader picture here of 1 through 11. So in Genesis 1 and 2, we had God's desire to bless mankind or human beings with life and a good earth to live on. That was all disrupted in Genesis chapters 3 and following, where sin brought death and it destroyed the good earth by a curse. And then we read about various sins, and we have the genealogy from Adam down to Noah. In chapters 6 through 8, God cleanses the earth by a great flood, but he spares Noah and his family because of God's desire to give mankind life. Now, this is the theme, this idea of giving life, but sin brings death. And so here in chapter 6 through 8, God destroys the world with a flood, but his desire still is to give life, and so he spares Noah and his family. After the flood, mankind continued in rebellion by making a name and choosing a land. This is the story of the Tower of Babel, where they traveled to the land of Shinar and chose that spot and said they wanted to make a name for themselves. And it's there, of course, that God confused the languages, which now brings us down to Abram. God calls Abram and promises him a name, seed, and a land because he desires to bless all the earth. So notice those themes of a name, seed, and land, which we see from the previous stories in chapter 11. Particularly, he promises to make Abram's name great, just as the people at the Tower of Babel tried to make their own name great. And he promises Abram a land, whereas the people at the Tower of Babel were trying to stay together and just claim a certain portion of land for themselves. But God scattered them, of course, across the face of the earth. And we talked last week how God's plan in all of choosing one man and his descendants wasn't because he was no longer interested in the rest of human beings, but because he wanted to use this man and his family to bring blessing to all the earth. And we'll see that pretty clearly when we get into chapter 12 today. Okay, so how you doing? You got everything you need? Okay, good. I can move on. I want to give us a broad outline of the Abraham story, and then I'm going to show us, surprise, surprise, that you can draw up the Abraham story in a nice chiastic structure. But first, the broad outline, okay? So this Toledot can be divided into 3 clearly defined sections. The first is the introduction, which we just read, which is the genealogy that shares with us who all of Terah's family are. And of course, the main participants here are going to be Abram and Sarai, although a few of these other people, like Lot and later on Nahor, will be important in the story as well. And then we have the main body, which is the bulk of the story of Abraham, which covers chapters 12 through 22. And the last section is sort of a transitional section to lead us to the next Toledot. And it deals with Sarah's death and how Isaac gets a bride and finally Abraham dying. Okay. So again, what I like to do, whether we're at the beginning of a biblical book or at the beginning of a new section, is step back and get the big picture before we dive in and get all of the intimate details. So this helps give us the big picture, and the next slide will as well. Now, the next slide I don't want you to copy down because it's too involved. But you can take a picture of it with your phone, or you can just look it up later on YouTube if you want. So here's a chiastic structure of the Abraham narrative. This takes us from the passage that we just read all the way through the end of chapter 22. So it doesn't deal with the conclusion of Abram's story that has the death of Sarah and bride for Isaac and all that. But notice that the section begins with a genealogy, A, and it ends with a genealogy. The B sections are the introduction and the climax to the story, and the story that really emphasizes Abraham's faith. In the first B story, God calls him to a land and calls him to leave everything he's ever known, and Abram obeys. And then in the last story in the B section, this is where God calls Abram to offer up Isaac. And there are a lot of similarities in wording, which we'll notice when we get to chapter 22. So the C sections are about Abram lying about his wife, Sarah. You remember there's 2 stories that do that. The D sections are about Lot settling in Sodom and then the problems in Sodom. The E sections deal with Abram interceding for both Lot and Sodom. And then right smack dab in the middle are stories that deal with God making a covenant with Abram, and also the birth of Ishmael and the announcement of the birth of Isaac. Okay, so whether this particular chiasm was planned by the inspired author, we can't say 100% for sure. But it is interesting still that we can lay out the Abraham story in this mirror structure. Okay, any comments on that before we move to the next slide? Okay, so I want to show you now that the passage we just read can also be outlined chiastically. So chapter 11, 27 through 32. And the main reason I'm pointing this chiasm out is, remember, the center of the chiasm is often a focal point of the chiasm. And right smack dab in the middle of this chiastic structure, we have the barrenness of Sarah proclaimed, and that she has no children. And this, of course, is going to be a huge part of the plot to come. This is going to be the main problem that Abram and Sarah are going to have to overcome, and that is her becoming pregnant and having a child. Okay? Now, as we look more carefully at this short little genealogy, one of the things that has kind of jumped out to Bible scholars is looking at the names, some of the names of Abram's family, and what it suggests. And what it suggests is that there is evidence of idolatry in Abram's family. Now, that could surprise you, or it might not, but I want us to look at a passage, first of all, that clearly states that Abraham comes from a family that practiced idolatry. So we're going to flip over to Joshua chapter 24. And Luke, I'll ask you to read both verse 2 and verse 15 of Joshua 24.
And Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served the gods. And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord."
So we have two passages here that clearly mention that the ancestors of Israel, Abram's parent, Terah, worshipped other gods. This means that Abram comes out of a background of idolatry. Okay, so God doesn't choose Abram because he's anything special. We have no indication here God chose Abram because he was the most righteous man on the earth, or anything similar to that. God chose Abram because he walked with God. No, it's simply an act of God's grace. This man lives in an idolatrous family, probably is an idolater himself at this point. But when God reveals himself to him, Abram responds. And from there, his relationship begins to grow with the Lord until finally, when we reach the sacrifice of Isaac, we see his complete obedience and his complete commitment to the Lord. Now, we're told that Abram was from the city of Ur of the Chaldees. Ur was known as a center of moon god worship. So if we're kind of wondering, well, what god or gods did the family of Abram worship? This is a good bet. And there are certain things here in the genealogy that's going to back this up. First of all, the name of the moon god, we know his name. His name was Sin. In our language, it looks like sin, so there's a lot of irony there, but in Hebrew, it'd be pronounced Sin. So Sin is the moon god in this area of the world, in Ur. Interestingly enough, Sarai was the name of Sin's wife. Okay, Sarai means princess. One of the other family members mentioned here is a lady named Milcah. Milcah means queen, and it is the title of Ishtar, Sin's daughter. So we're starting to get a good family picture here. Everyone in the family seems to have a name that reflects the worship of the moon god. Now this next one we're not 100% sure of, but Abram's father's name, Terah, may be related to the Hebrew word Yerach, which means moon. So you can see there's only one letter difference here, the T and the Y. So we can't say 100% for sure there's a correlation, but there might be. They certainly appear similar. Now later in the story of Genesis, Jacob is going to flee back to Haran to visit his uncle's house. Does anyone remember Jacob's uncle's name? Laban. Laban, or in Hebrew, Laban, means white one, which is a poetic term for the moon. Okay. And finally, Abram and his family leave Ur, and they come and they settle in Haran. They're supposed to be moving on to Canaan, but they actually stop in the city of Haran. And what we also know about the city of Haran is that it was also a center of moon worship. So Abram gets this call, and his father and the whole clan pick up and decide to move to Canaan. But instead of making it all the way to Canaan, once they come to Haran, they settle down there and they never leave until Abram finally steps out and goes on to the land of Canaan himself. Now, think about it. If God calls you to do something that you've never done before, and it's a huge step of faith, you know, it takes a lot of trust to step out and do it, doesn't it? And sometimes what happens is when we take this big step of faith, we're having to leave a lot of our securities behind us. And if we encounter a situation which is really familiar, which provides some security for us, it's tempting just to stay there. It's like, well, God, I did take a step. Isn't this far enough? Isn't this good enough? And I kind of imagine it. The text doesn't say so, but I kind of imagine this is what happens with Terah and the rest of the family. It's like, well, we left Ur after all, but Haran's so comfortable, and it reminds us so much of home. And we've got the moon god worship here again, and everything's really nice. So there's always that temptation for us to look for something to find our security in rather than to find our security simply in the Lord. And that might be what happens here. So when we get to chapter 12, God is going to call Abram and tell him to leave his family behind and to come into the land of Canaan. Okay, so as we mentioned, the big problem here is that Sarai is said to be barren and that she has no child. Of course, we don't know what God's promises are yet. We don't even know that God's going to promise Abram anything. But when we get to chapter 12, it becomes very clear that this is a problem. He's going to be a great nation, but he's got a barren wife. How does that work out, right? Okay, anything else in chapter 11? Okay, let's move to chapter 12 and Karena, verses 1 through 3.
The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country and your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on earth will be blessed through you." Okay, great. Now, let me just make a big statement. This is the key text of Genesis. Everything up to this point leads to this verse, and everything that follows on from here flows from this verse. The call of Abram in order to make him a blessing to all the nations of the earth is what the rest of the story is all about. And we saw what made this necessary in chapters 1 through 11. So this is the focal text of Genesis. Now, if this is the focal text of Genesis, we might expect our key word to be found here. What's our key word? Bless. And guess what? It occurs 5 times in these 3 verses. Now, one Bible commentator has put it this way. He's actually asked a question for us to consider. Does the 5 occurrences of blessing echo the 5 occurrences found in chapters 1 through 11? So isn't that interesting? The word bless occurs 5 times in chapters 1 through 11. And now here, in a matter of a few verses, it occurs 5 times. Okay. Or does it offset the 5 mentions of curse in chapters 1 through 11? So this idea of someone or something being cursed is mentioned 5 times in chapters 1 through 11. So he doesn't provide the answer, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but it is it does draw our attention to the fact, oh, this is interesting. The word bless occurs 5 times in 1 through 11, and the word curse occurs 5 times in 1 through 11. And here God now is speaking of blessing to Abram on 5 occasions. But in order for Abram to get this promise, there's something he has to do in verse 1. What is it that he has to do? Okay, he has to leave. What is he leaving?
His country, his father's house, family.
Right. Okay, so he's leaving 3 things here. There's 3 stages to this detachment that Abraham is called to do. He's called to get out of his country, okay? And then he's called to leave his family. Now, this is a word for like clan. It would include aunts, uncles, cousins. You know, it's the large family unit. And so he's being called to leave that. And then finally, he's even being called to leave his father's house. So this would be dad, mom, brothers, sisters. What God is doing is he is separating Abram from his background, his pagan background. And think about this. Whenever we give our lives to Christ, it depends the environment that you grew up in. Now, you might have grown up in a Christian home, and so you might not have had this experience. But for someone who becomes a believer and their family and friends were not believers, they step into a brand new world when they accept Jesus as their Savior. And if they continue to live in that old world of friendships and sometimes even family relationships, they can be drawn back away from the Lord and back into their previous lifestyle. So what God wants to do with Abram, he wants to do a new work in him. And that involves this idea of separation. Hey, Genesis 1, a new creation. In the original creation, God had to separate things in order to bring about a good world. And here he's having to separate Abram from his country, his family, and his father's house. Any thoughts on that?
I've definitely seen this before in friends that have come to Christ, especially if they're involved in drugs and things like that. They end up having to completely uproot their life.
Right.
A lot of times end up moving to another state or something.
Yeah.
Just to get away from the old life.
Exactly. And that's a huge commitment to make, isn't it? And a huge step of faith to make, to leave all that behind. Again, that was your identity. That was your security before. That was who you were. And now you're leaving all of that. It takes a great step of faith to do that. We've had some Israeli students here in the past whose mother and father and family were not Christians. And for them to accept Jesus meant that they had to separate from their family. It's a huge, huge step to make. And this is what's being asked of Abram here. Now, in verses 2 and 3, there are 7 elements to the call of Abram. First, there's the command. This isn't part of the 7 elements, but I want to note the command. It's to go. Okay? Go to where I show you to go. And the reason that's important is later on, this command is going to come back when he tells Abram to take Isaac. He's going to say, go and take your only son Isaac. So there's an echo of this command with the story later on. Now, as Abram goes, God makes promises to him. The first thing he says is, I will make you into a great nation. Well, if you're going to be a great nation, what do you need? You need kids. And what else do you need? You need land, right? Okay. So inherent in this promise to make Abram a great nation is this idea of both descendants and land. And then just the simple statement, I will bless you. So that's all encompassing. We've seen the primary blessing in Genesis 1 through 11 is to be fruitful and multiply. So this may be a statement of, I'm going to give you many descendants. You're going to be fruitful, okay? The third thing he says is, I will make your name great. This is what the people of the Tower of Babel wanted. They wanted to make their name great. The difference here is Abram's not trying to make his own name great. God is promising to make his name great. Now, who do we remember from the Tower of Babel? No one, really. Anyone remember Abraham? Do you think the world knows who Abraham is? I'd say God came through on this promise pretty well. So would you rather try to make people remember your name, or would you rather allow God to make people remember your name and make it great? Big difference, right? Now, the fourth promise falls right in the middle, and it's actually a command. It can be translated one of two ways, but the verb is an imperative, a command. So God says, be a blessing. I'm going to make you a great nation. I will bless you. I'll make your name great. So be a blessing, all right? And then the last three promises actually focus on other people. So the first three focused on Abram, and then God said, be a blessing. And now the last ones will focus on other people. He says, I will bless those who bless you. And then he says, he who curses you, I will curse. Notice the difference. I will bless those who bless you. He who curses you, I will curse. The inference is there's going to be a lot more people seeking to bless Abram and fewer seeking to curse him in this statement. And then finally, and this is a literal translation here, all the families of the ground will be blessed through you. Now, what's significant about the word ground here? Anyone remember what our word is? Adamah. Sorry?
And then this one makes to mankind.
That's right. And it was the Adamah that was cursed, right? Way back in Genesis 3. So I think it's significant that it's mentioned here. All the families of the Adamah, or the ground, will be blessed through you. Okay. And actually, we'll see this promise expanded upon in the future. And the Lord will specifically use the word in your seed. All the nations of the earth will be blessed. So it'll be worded just a little bit differently. Okay, now, you want to know these, okay? I'm not even kidding around with you. I'm just telling you, for the midterm, you want to know these. You want to know that Genesis 12, 1 through 3 is the key text of Genesis, and you want to be able to list these 7 elements of God's promise or call to Abram. You don't have to memorize them in order, but it might make it easier. Okay, so definitely know these. All right, so this is the foundation now that everything that comes after is going to build upon. And these promises are going to constantly be repeated to Abram and expanded on. And then they're going to be repeated to Isaac and then to Jacob. Remember that our introductory class last week, we looked at how this idea of the promises to the patriarchs was one of the key themes of the book of Genesis. And we said that the theme of the book of Genesis, if we were to sum it up in one statement, was what? Anybody remember that? What's our key word in Genesis? Blessing. What are we talking about here? We're talking about God's what? To Abram. God's promises. Okay? So, theme, God's promise of blessing. You will see that. I don't know if it's on the midterm or the final, or both. But know that statement, God's promise of blessing. Okay? Know it well. All right, I have a couple maps to throw up here for you. So, yeah, sure. But
do you think that these still apply to Israel today?
I do, yeah. And I think we see some of that happening. When people and nations bless Israel, there seems to be a blessing on them, and vice versa, many times a curse on those who aren't. And certainly that last promise is being fulfilled right now, isn't it? That in you, all the families of the ground are being blessed. So, yeah. Some of the others have already happened. I'll make you a great nation. I'll make your name great. I'll bless you. Those are things God has already fulfilled, but yet I think he's still working with the nation of Israel and being faithful to those promises. Good question. All right, so here's a map of the world of Abram's day, and the red line is the line that traces Abram's journey. So if you can find Ur down there in the bottom right-hand corner, that is in ancient Babylonia. Now, some people think there's actually a couple of different Urs. And some people think that this isn't the city that Abram was from, that it was another Ur. But traditionally, this is the one that is usually pointed to be his city. The city Haran, can you see it at the top of the screen, almost in the middle of the picture? So if Abram is from Ur down there in Babylonia, then that's quite a trek up to Haran, but then that's where the family settles. And then God calls Abram to come to the land of Canaan. And so we can follow that red line down into the land of Canaan. And as we look at the following verses here, it's going to trace Abram's route through the land of Canaan, stopping at various cities. Okay? Any questions on the map? I like to give maps and photos whenever I can, just to give you a mental picture of the geography and of what places look like. Okay, so these are the major empires that were around in the time of Abram. And Abram lived around 2000 BC, okay, somewhere in that era, 2100 to 2000 BC. And so we have the Egyptian Empire in the south that goes all the way up through the land of Canaan. And so the Egyptians actually controlled Canaan at this time, even though it was ruled by various Canaanite kings. Then we have the Babylonian Empire that we talked about. And that's not the Babylonian Empire that conquered Judah. That's the old Babylonian Empire, okay? And then we have the Hittite Empire, which is in the area of Asia Minor or modern Turkey. So this was by no means a backward time. There were major empires, there were major cities, commerce and trade happened between all of these places, battles took place. It was a busy, busy place, you know. Sometimes we think, oh, Abraham, he's out there with the sheep and he's all alone, you know. Not quite the accurate picture. Okay, so we'll talk about this map in a moment, but this gets us to the land of Canaan and to stops that Abram makes. But let's go ahead and read verses 4 through 9. Skylar.
So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, all the possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Morah, and the Canaanites were then in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain to the east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south.
Okay, so what we see in this passage is Abram comes into the land of Canaan. It gives various places where he stops, but he surveys the entire land. He comes all the way down. We've got Shechem there on the map, which is right in the heart of the land of Canaan. Bethel and Ai, where he also stops. And then all the way down, Hebron, Beersheba. It says he goes down to the south. And so that's that area down there. And Abram actually ends up settling down in the southern area, doesn't he? So he travels through the whole land. And we're told his age. How old is Abram at this point? 75. He's not a young, spry kid, is he? He's a mature man. And he doesn't leave alone. Who does he bring with him? Brings his wife, of course. And who else? And Lot and all the people whom he had acquired in Haran. Okay, good. Now, Abram was told to separate from his family, but he brings Lot with him. Okay. It may be at this point that Abram is thinking that Lot is going to be his heir, because after all, he and his wife are barren, and he's 75, she's 65, right? But as it turns out, God is going to have to separate Lot from Abram, which we'll see in the next chapter. Also, Abram's entourage, as you guys were pointing out, consists of all the people that he acquired in Haran. So it's not like we just have Abram, Sarai, and Lot traveling by themselves. This is a big entourage. And all of these people are going to become are already part of the family of Abram. These are not then physical descendants of Abram, and yet they are part of his household. So they are incorporated into what will become eventually Israel. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. In verse 6, we're told that Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh. Now, Moreh means instruction, so the tree of instruction. Don't quite know what that means, but apparently it was a place where people would sometimes get maybe prophetic revelation or some sort of divine instruction. We're told the Canaanites were in the land and that the Lord appeared to Abram. So here we go. He's at the tree of instruction and the Lord appears to him. And he says, to your descendants, I will give this land. So God there kind of expands on the promise of verses 2 and 3. He says, here, I'm going to give you descendants and I'm going to give you this land. So he hadn't specified yet to Abram before this what land he was going to give him. He just told him to come to the land that I'll show you, right? And so Abram's response in verse 7 is to build an altar to the Lord. And then we're told he moves on to Bethel and Ai, and he builds another altar, and there he calls on the name of the Lord. What's it mean to call on the name of the Lord? We've seen that already in Genesis. Anyone remember where we saw it? The 70th occurrence of the name of the Lord. No? How about that? What does it mean to call on the name of the Lord? By the way, it was the son of Seth, Enosh, at the end of chapter 4, verses 25, 26, where it says, then men began to call on the name of the Lord. We have this big quote up by John Walton about what it means to call on the name of the Lord. Anyone remember any part of that? What does it mean to you to call on the name of the Lord?
Isn't it about like making known to the people the ways of the Lord?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's about worshiping God. It's about proclaiming who he is, magnifying his name. There's actually several different aspects to it. But Abram here, he's building an altar, and so clearly he's calling on the name of the Lord. That is, he's worshiping God. But we're also told the Canaanites were then in the land. So he's doing it in the midst of this Canaanite population. So he's being a witness to the true God here, already within the land of Canaan. And then we're told in verse 9 that he journeyed going on still toward the south. Okay? Any thoughts or comments on anything in chapter 12 up to this point? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and take our break. It's just a couple minutes early, but we're at a good stopping point here. So we'll pause here and pick up here when we come back. Okay, so we're ready to pick up with verse 10. And in verses 10 through 18, we have the first story of Abram lying about his wife, Sarai. So let's see, whose turn to read? Is it yours, Chris?
I think so.
Yeah, okay.
At that time, a severe famine struck the land of Canaan, forcing Abram to go down to Egypt, where he lived as a foreigner. As he was approaching the border of Egypt, Abram said to his wife Sarai, "Look, you are a very beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife. Let's kill him, then we can have her.' So please tell them you are my sister. Then they will spare my life and treat me well because of their interest in you." And sure enough, when Abram arrived in Egypt, everyone noticed Sarai's beauty. When the palace officials saw her, they sang her praises to Pharaoh, their king, and Sarai was taken into his palace. Then Pharaoh gave Abram many gifts because of her: sheep, goats, cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord sent horrible plagues upon Pharaoh and his household because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh summoned Abram and accused him sharply. "What have you done to me?" he demanded. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?"
Okay. I'm thinking we ought to read these last two verses as well. Finish off the story.
"Why did you say, 'She is my sister,' and allow me to take her as my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and get out of here." Pharaoh ordered some of his men to escort them, and he sent Abram out of the country along with his wife and all his possessions.
Okay. Now notice in verse 10 that we have a famine in the land. Have you ever been looking forward to getting something, and then when you first get it, it's exciting, but it isn't long before the excitement wears off and it's not everything you thought it would be? You're like, man, you know. I wonder if that's how Abram felt. He comes into the land of Canaan, and God's like, "I'm going to give you this land to your descendants." And he's like, "Wow, Lord, this is awesome." And then a famine hits. Oh, okay. So this is the land you're giving me, huh, Lord? And notice that there's no command from the Lord to go to Egypt. And there's no prayer by Abram, "Lord, should I stay here or should I go to Egypt?" He just picks up and goes to Egypt. All right. And so it seems to be a lack of faith on Abram's part to not stay in the land that God was promising him and to go down into Egypt. However, while he's there, there's definitely a greater act of unfaithfulness. And what's that?
Lying about his wife.
Lying about his wife. And okay, so what's so bad about that? He's protecting himself, isn't he?
He's not having faith in God's promise.
Because God had made a lot of promises to him, right? So yeah, this is the really big thing here, is that God had promised to be with Abram and to bless him and to, give his descendants the land of Canaan. Well, if Abram gets killed here, he's not going to have any descendants to pass the land on to. So it does show a lack of faith on his part. So he tells Sarai, or asks her to say that she's his sister, which she does. And why is he concerned that someone might want her for their wife?
She's very beautiful.
Very beautiful. And how old is she? 65. Wow, interesting. Okay. Well, a couple of things along those lines. Many Bible commentators often point out that, first of all, there were different standards of beauty in the ancient Near East than there are today. Doesn't mean she was a runway model, okay? And also, because Sarah does live to age 127, they're saying, well, she's about halfway through her life here. And so, maybe she didn't age as quickly as some other people, and maybe she was still physically very attractive. Now, one of the things we're going to see as we go through Genesis is that oftentimes in the ancient world, it was a brother that would negotiate whether his sister would marry someone. So part of Abram's plan here is, as the brother, he gets the say-so whether his sister can marry someone else or not. And of course, he would have the prerogative to say no. But when it's Pharaoh that asks, that prerogative goes out the window. So Abram, I would imagine, hadn't planned for that little contingency. And so when Pharaoh says that he wants her for his wife, Abram gives her up. Now, it does seem here, based on what many Bible scholars say, it says in verse 19, well, I don't like the way the King James is worded. It says, I might have taken her as my wife, but literally it says, I took her as my wife, okay? So it might very well be that Pharaoh had sexual relations with Sarai at this point, which is a really weird position for Abram to be in here. And what about the promise of having children? And now he's given his wife away, and she's married to the Pharaoh of Egypt. Well, thank heaven, God steps in, doesn't he? And what is it that God does? Oh, he plagues the Egyptians. Does that sound familiar? Actually, we're going to see a number of things here that foreshadow the story of the Exodus. So within the life of Abraham, actually the Exodus is a story that shows the descendants of Abraham living out a similar experience to what Abraham had. So there's a famine in the land, and Abram goes down to Egypt. Same thing happened later on. There's a famine in the land, and Jacob takes the family down to Egypt, and they settle there. And that's then where they begin to grow into a nation. We read about the descent into Egypt in chapter 12 and again in chapter 47. And then Abram is afraid that someone will kill him. No one actually does, of course. But we could say there's at least an allusion here to the idea of attempting to kill, in this case, the male leader, and save the female. And this is exactly what happens in Exodus chapter 1, where the Pharaoh rises up who doesn't know Joseph, and he wants to put all of the male Hebrew children to death, and he spares the female. The plagues are an obvious parallel. And then what we can call the spoiling of Egypt. This is where, Abram comes off pretty good here. He's given a lot of wealth by the Pharaoh. And when Pharaoh finally kicks him out of the land, he doesn't take that wealth back, probably because he fears the God of Abram, who has plagued Egypt. And then, of course, when Israel leaves Egypt, they are told to ask the Egyptian for, all kinds of things. And the Egyptians willingly give them things to get them out of the land. So another similarity. And then we have the deliverance. Abram is delivered. One could have thought Pharaoh could have been so angry that he could have put him to death. But again, apparently Pharaoh fears the God of Abram, and he fears to touch Abram. And so he just rebukes him and then kicks him out of the land. And of course, Israel itself is delivered from Egyptian bondage. So a lot of interesting parallels. Again, we see this idea of typology. happening in the scripture. Only here it's a foreshadowing. And then when we get to Egypt, to the story of the Exodus, we recall, oh yeah, Abraham went through some similar experiences. Very interesting. Okay. So Pharaoh's question in verse 18, what have you done? Heard that somewhere before, haven't we? Told you we'd see it a lot in the book of Genesis. So he's basically accusing Abram of sin, of wronging him. Why would you do this to me? Now, when God called Abram, he said to do what in regards to others? Be a blessing, right? Those who bless you, I will bless. The one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So is Abram being a blessing here? No, not at all. In fact, Abram has brought a curse on the Egyptians because the Pharaoh unknowingly has taken Abram's wife. So he who curses you, I will curse, even unknowingly. You know, there is such a thing as unknowing sin. The book of Leviticus talks about that God will forgive even sins that are committed that one doesn't realize at the time they're committing. So even though Pharaoh doesn't purposely jeopardize Abram's family, the fact is that he does, and God, being faithful to his promise, sends the plagues and the judgment on Egypt. Meanwhile, he's faithful to Abram by blessing him with all of this sustenance and wealth. So this story can leave you sitting back and going, that seems a little unfair. What do you think about Abraham being blessed and Pharaoh getting the bad end of the deal here?
It does seem like you should have given some of that back after all the problems he just caused.
Yeah. How do you feel about Abram in this story?
He just seems like really weak. Like, he's supposed to be a father of all nations, but at that moment he won't even protect his wife.
Yeah, okay. More worried about saving his own skin.
Yeah.
And not trusting in God's promises and all of that.
Or protecting his wife.
Yeah, exactly. So this might be a little bit of the leftover from his pagan background, you know, and he's having to learn to trust in this God and that he can trust the word of God here when God makes promises. And so God blesses Abram in spite of his sin and his lack of faith. And the one thing that I think of is, how many times has God blessed me in spite of my sin? And how many times has God not given me what I deserved, but instead has been very gracious to me? So when I read the story of Abram, I get kind of upset at him. But then when I think about my own life, I'm like, wow, God, I'm glad you're really that kind of God, a blessing God, right? Anything else in these verses? Okay, we're going to move on to chapter 13. Yeah, so that heading should have been 12, verses 10 through 20. Sorry about that.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry.
No problem.
Would this have kind of created like a grudge in the heart of the Egyptians towards Israel, even though Israel wasn't exactly an established nation?
Yeah.
At this point?
I would certainly think it would have created a grudge toward Abram and his family at this point, which is why the Pharaoh kicks him out of Egypt. You're not welcome here any longer, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's obviously not why Egypt later enslaves Abram's family, because a whole lot of other things happen in between. You know, Joseph is a great blessing to the Egyptians, and they love and appreciate Jacob's family because of what Joseph does for them. So, yeah. All right, good question. Okay, so Aoife, I think it's your turn. Would you read verses 1 through 7, chapter 13?
Then Abram went up from Egypt, and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land.
Okay, thanks. So the family of Abram, they come up from Egypt, and we read in verse 2 that he was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. So God said he's going to bless him, and in fact, he is. There's a little wordplay going on here. Back in chapter 12, verse 10, where it describes the famine, it says the famine was severe in the land. The word in Hebrew is literally heavy, that the famine was heavy in the land. And here in chapter 13, verse 2, when it says that Abram was very rich, literally he was very heavy in livestock, in silver, and in gold. So Abram thought he was in a rough place there with the famine back in chapter 12. But what he's learned is that this God is faithful and blesses him through difficult times and even through sins that he commits. So Abram is doing well at this point, as is his nephew Lot. Now, where is it that Abram goes to when he returns to the land?
Does he go back to Bethel?
Yes. It says that he went as far as Bethel, to the place his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. And then verse 4, to the place of the altar which he had made. Why do you think Abram is going back there and going back to this altar? Why are we being told about this?
Where God originally sort of blessed him. And then sort of the covenant being reestablished after the time of Egypt.
Right. Yeah. This is the place where he had called on God, and God had made promises to him and blessed him. So these words in verses 3 and 4, at the beginning, and the altar he had made at first, I think is a way of demonstrating Abram's recommitment to the Lord. He's going back to where he started. He's going back to the beginning. We can maybe infer here that Abram's saying, God, I messed up, but you took care of me. You were faithful. And so it's a sort of a rededication to the Lord here. We're told that he calls on the name of the Lord. There's that phrase again, okay? So we know what that means now. He's worshiping God. He's proclaiming God's name. So we've just been told how wealthy Abram is and how God protected him when he was in Egypt. And so it's only natural that he would come back to this altar and want to worship God and call on his name. So what else do we learn in these verses?
If you lost, people aren't really getting along.
Okay.
They have to split off.
Yeah, so they're not getting along. Why is that? They've both been blessed so much. This is a terrible problem to have. We both have so much stuff, there's not room for the two of us, right? And so it's not Abram and Lot that quarrel, but the herdsmen, right, of Abram and Lot that quarrel. And of course, this concerns Abram very much. Now, one of the things that we read in verse 7, as we read about this strife between the herdsmen of Lot and Abram, then we have this statement, the Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. Why are we told that?
there's sort of a reason why Abram and Lot were confined to the space.
Okay. So it may explain it's not just Abram and Lot in this area, but there are these other people groups that are in the area. Okay. Any other thoughts? Because the author doesn't actually come out and tell us why the statement is made. So I think that's a good reason, but I think there might be one or two others that we could even come up with. Of course, late on a Tuesday night, maybe not.
Was this the land that they were supposed to be living in from the start?
Yes, yeah, they're back in Canaan. They're there near Bethel and Ai. So,
we read about the heads if it's the different nationalities.
That the herdsmen, Abram and Lot's herdsmen, are of different nationalities. Well, I guess we don't know. That could be a possibility. What would that have to do with the Canaanites and Perizzites?
It was Canaanites and Perizzites.
Oh, I see. I think there's a distinction being made here between the herdsmen of Lot and the fact that the Canaanites and Perizzites are in the land. One of the thoughts that comes to me is that Abram is a stranger in a foreign land, isn't he? He's in the land that belongs currently to the Canaanites and the Perizzites and all these Canaanite groups. So for his family to have problems and strife, first of all, could be potentially dangerous. To have a schism here in a foreign land when you have other peoples around you, maybe you don't know if they're going to be friendly to you or not. That could potentially be dangerous. Or the other thing is, if Abram is calling on the name of the Lord and is to be a blessing to the other nations, right? And he's to be a witness, well, it wouldn't be a very good witness for him to have this squabbling going on in his family. And so Abram, to his credit, is going to step forward and deal with it here, beginning in verse 8. Any other thoughts? Verses 1 through 7. Okay, let's go ahead and read verses 8 through 13.
Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is it not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go right. Or if you take the right hand, I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they had separated from each other. Abraham settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord.
Okay. So Abram takes the first step and says, "Let there be no strife between me and my herdsman and your herdsman." We're brothers, or we're kinsmen, as your translation says. Now, the proper protocol would normally have been for the older person in the relationship to get to choose what direction they wanted to go, what land they wanted to settle in. But Abram is very gracious here, and he actually gives Lot his choice. So he says, if you take the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Now, what is the left and the right? Geographically, what are we talking about? Do you know? So normally, people would be facing east, the rising of the sun. So the left would be north and the right would be south. So Abram is actually telling Lot, take a piece of the promised land. You go north, I'll go south. You go south, I'll go north. And some people think that one of the reasons Abram makes this offer is he's still perhaps thinking that Lot might be his heir and that this land's eventually going to go to Lot anyway. Okay?
So that's a possibility. Some would disagree with that. But Lot doesn't choose either one, right? He doesn't go north, he doesn't go south. What direction does Lot go? East. Oh, yeah, our favorite direction in the book of Genesis, right? So in verse 10, it says, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of the Jordan. Now listen to this description. It was well watered everywhere. And then we get this little parenthetical statement. Before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, now if you've never read the book of Genesis before, that's got to be like, whoa, what's going on here? What's that about, right? Okay, so there's a little warning. Something bad is going to happen in this area. But as Lot looks at the territory, he sees it like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Now talk to me about those two descriptions, the garden of the Lord, the land of Egypt. When he sees this land, he goes, wow, reminds me of Eden, reminds me of Egypt. What should we make of that?
It's a very sort of green land that's quite plentiful. So just fled to Egypt to escape the famine.
Yeah, okay, so it's a plentiful land, like the garden was, right? And like Egypt was. Egypt was a shelter for them during the famine. But what happened in the garden and what happened in Egypt? We were kicked out. Guess what's going to happen to Lot when he chooses Sodom? Ah, okay. So we can see both positive and negative connotations here to this description of how this area looks like the garden of the Lord and looks like the land of Egypt. So in 11, we're told that Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed and they separated from each other. Now I want to pop up a few key words in this story here, because I think that these key words will remind us of a story we've already read in Genesis. So I'm suggesting we might have a little typology going on here. First of all, we have the word brothers. Abram says, let there be no strife between us because we're brothers. Now, the Hebrew word for brother means relative or kinsman, as you have in your translation. But it's literally here the word brothers, okay? Next, we have this word separation, which is emphasized 3 different times. So God had called Abram to separate from his country, his family, and his father's house. And Abram had done a pretty good job, but he took Lot with him. And so now, ironically, as God blesses them, it forces Abram to let Lot go, to separate, for them to go their own ways. So now Abram truly will be on his own without the rest of the family. And God can do the work that he wants to do. Okay, so I want to suggest to you that these words and then some other things that I'm going to put up have similarities with the story of the Tower of Babel. First of all, in the story of the Tower of Babel, separation was a key word, this idea of spreading out or separating, and how the people refused to spread out. And so eventually God separated them by giving them different languages. We read in the story of the Tower of Babel how they traveled east to a plain. Well, guess what? Lot is going to travel east, and he also is going to travel to a city on a plain. And as I mentioned, the word separation occurs in both stories. So in the words like the garden of the Lord and like Egypt, we already have an ominous sign that the land Lot is choosing, it looks great now, but there's going to be problems ahead. And the parenthetical statement, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, is a huge warning that Lot is being deceived by his eyes. What he sees looks good, but he's going to pay a heavy price for the choice that he makes. Same was true with the story of the Tower of Babel. They thought they had a good plan, but it all went awry, and they experienced the consequences of the choices that they made. Now, after both of these stories, Abram travels through the land, receives the promise, and builds an altar. So at the end of the story of the Tower of Babel, obviously we have the genealogy of Shem, but that leads us to Abram, and that leads to the story of him traveling through the land, receiving God's promise, and building an altar. Here, interestingly enough, as we finish the chapter, Abram's going to do the same thing. He's going to travel through the land, receive an expanded version of God's promise, and he's going to build an altar to the Lord. So a lot of interesting parallels then between this story about Lot and his choice and the story of the Tower of Babel. Okay. Any thoughts or questions before we move on? Sorry, I swallowed wrong. Okay, you have something? No, okay. Well, if you can read over my coughing. Let's do verses 14 through 18. I think it's your turn.
And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. And Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord.
Okay. So in verse 14, after Lot separates from Abram, God says to him, lift your eyes now and look. Go back to verse 10 and notice that it said, and Lot lifted his eyes and saw. So there is sort of a contrast going on here between what Lot saw through his human eyes and what he thought was the best land. And by the way, this is a very selfish choice on Lot's part, wasn't it? I mean, Abram gives him the choice, and he says, oh, if you're going to give me the choice, I'm going to take what looks best. You know, rather than deferring to Abram, say, no, you choose, and I'll go the opposite direction from what you choose. So a contrast here in that it's the Lord that lifts up Abram's eyes. And then he begins to reiterate the promises, but he expands a little bit on the promises. What's different here? Some new information here that we haven't seen before.
The information about the land, or
whatever looks new to you here in these verses.
this is a permanency.
Sorry?
A permanency. This is like his descendants forever.
Okay, good. A permanency in this idea of descendants forever, giving the land to your descendants forever. How about verse 16 even? I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth. He had promised him descendants, but this is now like, this is going to be a huge multitude. Okay.
Didn't he say they'll be numbered like the stars in the sky?
That comes later. Yeah, he's going to say that when we get to chapter 15. So dust of the earth, stars of the heavens, you know, pretty good promise to Abram regarding his descendants. Then he tells him to walk through the land. And this is so Abram can basically survey the land and see the land that God is giving him. And some people think that this is actually a symbolic way of Abram claiming the land. Walking through the land, I'm surveying this land because it's going to be mine, or it's going to be my descendants. Okay. And after he does this, Abram moves down south to Hebron. and he builds an altar there to the Lord. Now, the map that I have up on the screen is actually a map, as you can tell, that says Solomon's kingdom. But this is actually the territory that God promises to Abram. We're actually not going to see this till we get to the end of chapter 15. But he promises Abram that he can have the land from the Euphrates River, which is at the very top there, that yellow, the light yellow portion of Solomon's kingdom touches the Euphrates River, all the way down to the river of Egypt, which is not the Nile, but it's a river in the Sinai Peninsula. And you can tell that this was the territory that was inhabited by Israel during Solomon's reign. But this is the only time in Israel's history that they actually dwelt in all the land that God intended for them. Okay, so it's really kind of sad, actually, that God had wanted to give them so much more, but because of a lack of faith and because of disobedience, they actually possessed much less. Now, we'll see more of that when we get to the end of chapter 15, where we read the description of the borders of the land. Okay? I want to show you a couple of other maps to help us understand. People are always talking about where's Sodom located, and I'm aware of at least 3 different places that people say is ancient Sodom. There may even be more than that. The one that convinces me the most has to do with this map I'm showing you here. Now, when it said that Lot lifted up his eyes and he saw the plain of the Jordan, the word for plain in Hebrew is kikar. And what it means is like a disc-shaped flat object. If you look at the area north of the Dead Sea, this is the area where the Jordan River flows, and it's also a very flat, disc-shaped area. So one of the arguments that is made today is that for Lot to be able to look down from the Bethel Ai area and see the plain of the Jordan, this is the area that he must have seen. In other words, some people want to put Sodom and Gomorrah down at the southern end of the Dead Sea. But from the location here at Bethel, you would not be able to see the southern end of the Dead Sea, but you would easily see the Jordan Valley. Okay? And there are a few places in Scripture where this area is described as the Kikar of the Jordan, or the plain of the Jordan. So if that geography is correct, it means that Sodom is somewhere within this disc-shaped area. And one archaeologist believes that he has discovered it at a place called Tal el Hammam. So if you go over to the extreme right, about the center of the disc, you see in parenthesis there Sodom with a question mark. So some people today believe that this is actually where Sodom is. And by the way, there are a number of other cities in this area, because it says there are 5 cities of the plain that are destroyed or potentially destroyed here in the judgment of God. So again, this shows how this area can be seen from Bethel and Ai, and it can also be seen from the Hebron area. Because when God actually destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, Abram's going to be in Hebron, and he's going to come over and look down into the valley and see the destruction. So the mountains here, any of you guys ever been to Israel? Anyone? Okay, Blake, you've been there. You've been down into the Dead Sea area, right, Blake?
No, I went to Jerusalem.
Okay.
Currently.
Well, again, even if you go up into Jerusalem, you're going up into a very mountainous area, right? So Jerusalem and Hebron, they're about 3,000 feet above sea level. They're up in the mountains, where the Dead Sea is the lowest spot on earth. It's something like 1,400 feet below sea level. So there's a good 4,400 foot difference here. So from the mountains in Hebron or up at Bethel and Ai, you could easily look down into the Jordan Valley, and you could see the area where Sodom would have been. From Hebron, you could potentially look down and see the southern end of the Dead Sea, where some people think Sodom is, but you couldn't do that from Bethel and Ai. And so this is another argument for why they think that Sodom's in this area. But I just wanted to show you a couple slides. This is the ancient city that they believe might be Sodom. These days it's called Tal el Hammam, which is an Arabic name. And here is some of the excavation. You can Google this and see all kinds of pictures of the excavations going on there. And one of the things they found is they've dug down to the time period when Abraham would have lived, and they have found, in fact, that the city was burnt to a crisp, and they have charred ruins and all that sort of thing. So this lends some support to the fact that this may well be the city. And I was teaching this a couple of years ago to my Genesis class, and we had a student who was in the class who had actually gone on an archaeological dig to this site, and she dug here. And she was totally convinced that this was Sodom after having dug there. So, you know, there are other suggestions that are made as to where Sodom is. In my opinion, this does seem to be the most likely. But there's no neon sign saying Sodom was here, you know, so all you can do is go on the archaeological evidence available and study the Bible and the geography, the description of the geography that it gives, and then, you know, form your opinion from that. So, ready to move into chapter 14. We'll just get started on 14 before we take our break. Now, 14 is an unusual chapter. It's very clear that it's an ancient document that Moses or a later editor of Genesis has inserted into the story. And the reason is because there's several things about it that are unusual. First of all, it has a lot of ancient names of places. And then in parenthesis, we have the updated names of the place. So the parenthesis is the current author, maybe Moses, saying, okay, here's the ancient name, but here's what we call it today, okay? And the other thing that's unusual about this story, it's the only place that we read in the whole Abram story of him being any kind of a warrior and fighting a battle. So it's unusual for that reason as well. But right away, we're going to see that Lot gets himself in trouble by living in Sodom, because Sodom and some of the other cities around where he lives are going to be attacked by some kings from the east. So let's go ahead and read all the way through verse 16. And then we might start to chat about it, and then we'll take our break and we'll finish talking about this section. But we got some names in here, so lucky you, Karena. Go for it.
At that time, when Abram fell, was king of Shinar, Ariel king of Eleazar, Kedorlaomer king of Elam, and Tidal king of Goyim. These kings went to war against Ber king of Sodom, Bersha king of Gomorrah, Shinab king of Adam, Shemar king of Zayim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these later kings joined forces in the valley of Sim, that is the Dead Sea Valley. For 12 years they had been subject to Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year,
Can't get away from him.
Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him went out and defeated the Reubenites in Asher, Canarim, and the Zizites in the Ham, the Emites in Shev Koriathim, and the Orites in the hill country of Seir, as far as Al-Paran near the desert. Then they turned back and went to En-Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites, as well as the Amorites who lived in Azalon's Jamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, the king of Bela, that is Zoar, marched out and drew up their battle lines in the valley of Siddim against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Hilo, king of Goim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arel, king of Elisar. 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and when King Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of the men fell into them, and the rest fled to the hills. The 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food. Then they went away. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. A man who escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. Now Abram was living near the great trees of Mamre the Amorite, a brother of Eshcol and Aner, all who were allied with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them and routed them, pursuing them as far as Gobah, north of Damascus. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and other people.
Okay, thank you. Good job. Glad you made it through that. Aren't you happy you got chosen for that passage? I just want to talk about a couple of these kings, and then we'll take our break. So we have 5 kings from the Mesopotamia area who come and they control the land of Canaan. You can sort of see the path that these kings took. The red arrow shows they came down on what would today be the modern country of Jordan. They came down that side, fighting and conquering, and then they went up the other side, the land of Canaan, and they were heading back to Mesopotamia. I'm not going to talk about any of those kings because historically we can't identify any of them. We don't have any records to know who these guys were. We know some of the nations. We know Shinar is Babylon. We know Elam is territory in modern day Iran or Persia, that sort of thing. But verse 2, I want to look at the names of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is very interesting. The name of the king of Sodom is Berah, and in Hebrew, literally, it means in evilness or with evilness. Okay? And the name of the king of Gomorrah is Bersha, which means in wickedness or with wickedness. Okay? These are probably not the real names of the kings. One of the things that Hebrew writers love to do was make plays on names. And so if a name sounded like something and they wanted to make fun of that name, they would change it just slightly. So here we have the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah being basically entitled king of wickedness and king of evil. Okay, well, that tells us everything we need to know about the kind of cities that they are ruling over. And we've already been told that the people of Sodom were exceedingly wicked before the Lord, and that the Lord at some point was going to destroy these cities. Okay, so we'll pause here and go ahead and take our break, and we'll talk about these verses a little bit more when we come back. What'd you forget? Oh no, you're not through. Sorry about that. Okay, one of the things I want to point out to you guys, when these 5 kings from Mesopotamia come to attack, they not only attack these 4 kings, but we're told about other areas that they attack in verses 5 and 6. And what I want you to know is that a lot of the people listed here are Nephilim, descendants of the Nephilim. So this is really fascinating. Now, how do we know this? Well, first of all, notice it says they came and attacked the Rephaim. Now, the Rephaim are descendants of the Nephilim. We have that in other passages. And then these peoples, the Zuzim, the Emim, those are Nephilim peoples. And we read about them over in Deuteronomy chapter 2. And I'll tell you what, I'll just give you this passage to jot down. We won't take the time right now to read it. But Deuteronomy 2, verses 20 through 23. And then there's also a passage in Deuteronomy 3 that talk more about the Rephaim and so on. But anyway, that'll be good. So this is one of the ways that we know these are descendants of the Nephilim, because over in Deuteronomy 2, Moses identifies them as such. So here's one of the things that I think is happening. We have some kings who have been serving these kings from Mesopotamia for 12 years. They're tired of it. So in the 13th year, they rebel. This is common stuff that happened in the ancient world all the time. So these 5 kings come because they're like, we're not going to let you rebel. You're going to keep paying us the money you've been paying us. So they come to fight them. But along the way, they encounter a number of these people who are descendants of the Nephilim. And apparently they destroy a number of them. Now that's sort of a plus along the way, because if you remember, these descendants of the Nephilim are a hybrid people. They're part human and part spiritual being, and they're demonic. And the idea that I get from this, and actually I got it from another scholar, it wasn't my idea, but is that we've seen how spiritual beings keep trying to thwart the plan of God. So the serpent in the garden, the sons of God in Genesis 6, and again, the sons of God in Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel. So what it seems has happened is that these evil beings have planted their seed throughout the area of the promised land. Now, why would they do that? Because these people then would be an impediment toward God giving this land to the descendants of Abram. So it's sort of a spiritual plot. We see that, I do want us to look at one passage. Turn over to Numbers chapter 13, because we have reference here to these guys. So let's look at verses 32 and 33 of Numbers 13. Scholar, is it your turn?
32 and 33.
Yes.
And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land whose ours is inhabited, and the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, descendants of the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight.
So this is the story of the 12 spies, the end of the story, where they come back and 10 of them give a bad report, because they said we saw Nephilim in the land. And then we read that the descendants of Anak, or the Anakim, as we read about later in Scripture, were descendants of the Nephilim. And they're described as being very large, and they terrify these spies. And when the spies tell all of Israel about it, Israel's like, there's no way we can conquer the land. So this is another indication that this is a spiritual rebellion, with these descendants of the Nephilim being planted throughout the promised land to try and intimidate Israel and to try to prevent Israel from eventually taking the land. And this is why, how many of you guys are in Joshua? All of you but Blake, probably. When you get to Joshua chapter 11, at the end of the chapter, there's going to be a specific notice about how the Israelites destroyed all of the Anakim, descendants of the Nephilim, except for the Anakim that lived in 3 cities. And those 3 cities are Philistine cities. One of them is Gath, where Goliath later comes from, whom David defeats. So this idea of the Nephilim sort of runs all the way through, at least up into 1 Samuel. And I think that they're finally defeated in the time of David, because we read how some of David's men killed some of the other people who were Rephaim or related to Goliath. We read about that in 2 Samuel. So anyway, I've read over that passage many times before and seen these weird names that are hard to pronounce, and I thought, what do I care about all this? But as I started to learn the bigger plot of the story,
It's like, oh, that's what's going on here. So whether God used these kings purposely to fight against some of the descendants of the Nephilim, or whether it's just something that happened historically, it ends up actually helping out Israel a little bit, even though Lot gets caught up in the whole thing and gets captured and taken. So throughout this story, have you noticed these little parentheses where it would describe, it would give the ancient word and it would say that is, and then it would say what it is now. So that's the updating of the text here. Abram obviously hears about Lot being taken. And so what does Abram do? Okay, how many has he got? Close. It says 318. And notice that these are all people, it says trained people or trained servants who were born in his own house. Now, this isn't every servant that Abraham has. This is every servant who's been trained to fight. Now, that tells you how large this entourage with Abram is. And we're getting the picture here of Abram being sort of like a king, or at least a prince. And he battles kings and he beats kings. Okay? So this theme of kingship is starting to appear in the story, and we're going to see more of it in just a moment when we meet Melchizedek and the king of Sodom. So Abram, he pursues these people and he surprise attacks them and captures Lot and all of the other people to bring them back. Now, where does Abram go to as he pursues Lot and finally catches up with what we'll call the bad guys and is able to deliver Lot? Where are they at?
It says as far as Dan.
As far as Dan, okay? There's another updated word, Dan. The city was not called Dan in Abram's day. Why is that? The tribe of Dan didn't exist. That's exactly right. So Dan is actually a great grandson of Abram. And we learn in the book of Judges that the city there is called Laish, and it doesn't get its name changed to Dan until the tribe of Dan moves there. So this is, by the way, after the time of Moses. So that means that the book of Genesis went through some updates from the time of Moses on, updating place names and making some things more familiar to the current readers, okay? So that's all that means. Now, one of the interesting things, though, is if you go to Tel Dan today in Israel, and if you've been there, Blake, yeah, you can see this gate that dates back to the time of Abram. So we don't know for sure, but it's possible that Abram passed through this gate because it was there in his day. Kristen.
So I was wondering, I know a lot of people didn't think that Moses wrote this, but since Moses did go into the land, how is it called Dan? Like if they haven't entered the land yet?
Yeah, so this is what I'm saying. There were definitely updates that happened later. So I firmly believe that Moses wrote most of it, but the form that we have Genesis in today, as we sit here, it went through several other hands of updating some information over the centuries, okay? Yeah. So clearly it could not have been called Dan till at least the days of the judges, right? Okay, good question. Anything else? All right, so we're ready for this really interesting meeting that Abram has with this mysterious king called Melchizedek, right? Verses 17 through 24.
After Abram returned from his victory over Kedorlaomer and all his allies, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shalom, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem and priest of God Most High, brought Abram some bread and wine. Melchizedek blessed Abram with this blessing. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you. And Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the goods he had recovered. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give back my people who were captured, but you may keep for yourself all the goods you have recovered." Abram replied to the king of Sodom, "I solemnly swear to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will not take so much as a single thread or sandal from what belongs to you. Otherwise, you might say, I am the one who made Abram rich. I will accept only what my young warriors have already eaten, and I request that you give a fair share of the goods to my allies, Honor, Eshcol, and Mamre."
Okay, thank you, Chris. So as Abram comes back victorious with all of the spoils of the battle, who comes out to meet him but this guy named Melchizedek, who is king of Salem. And what is Salem? Anybody know?
Means peace.
Sorry?
Means peace.
Means peace. This is an ancient name for the city of Jerusalem. Okay, Jerusalem. Okay, you can hear the last half of the name of the city there. So this Melchizedek is a king in Jerusalem. And he greets Abraham. Clearly, he is wanting to bless Abram because of the victory that God has given him, and because Abram's bringing back all the people, all the stuff that was stolen. And so it's sort of a coming out of the city and rejoicing and thanking Abram for what he's done. But this guy, he just appears out of nowhere, doesn't he? And then we don't hear any more about him except in Psalm 110, and then later in the book of Hebrews, he's discussed. He's also discussed in some Jewish literature in the intertestamental period time. But he's rather mysterious. His name, Melchizedek, means my king is righteous or king of righteousness. Malki is my king, and Zedek in Hebrew is righteous or righteousness. So his name means king of righteousness. And he comes out and he blesses Abram in the name of God Most High. And we're told that he's not only a king, but he's a priest. He's a priest of God Most High. And in verse 19 and 20, we have the blessing that he pronounces on Abram. And Abram honors Melchizedek. It says he gave him a tenth of all, or he gave him a tithe at the end of verse 20. Now, what I believe we have going on here is a contrast between two types of kings, because we have Melchizedek, who is clearly a righteous king. And in verse 21, we're going to turn and view the king of Sodom and his interaction with Abram. We already know the king of Sodom is a wicked guy, and even his name means that he's evil. So the king of Sodom says in 21, give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. This is a very abrupt and rude statement that the king of Sodom is making here. Notice how Melchizedek comes blessing and bringing out wine and bread. In other words, some kind of feast to refresh these warriors who've just come back from this battle and to thank them for what they've done. The king of Sodom offers no thanks. He just has a command. Give me the people, take the goods for yourself. So we have a very strong contrast between Melchizedek and the king of Sodom. And Abram gives him what for? He says, I'm not taking anything lest you say you've made Abram rich. And so my allies who are with me, they can take their share of the spoils, but the rest I'm giving back to you because I don't want to be associated with you, basically is what Abram says. Okay. Now, there is this one thought that Melchizedek is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. Okay, I don't know if you guys have ever heard that.
I'll tell you right up front, I don't agree with that, okay? And here's the reason why. This idea comes from the book of Hebrews, but the writer of Hebrews never says that Melchizedek is Jesus. What it says is that he is like the Son of God, okay? If somebody is like something, then they're not that somebody. They are like them. And what the writer of Hebrews is doing is typology. He's saying this king, Melchizedek, reminds us of our great high priest, Jesus. He is king of righteousness. He's king of Salem, which is king of peace. And the writer of Hebrews plays on all of those names. And he says he's without genealogy, without father and mother, being like the Son of God. Now, the reason the writer of Hebrews says that is because we have no genealogy in the book of Genesis of Melchizedek. We're not told who his mother or father are. He just appears on the scene, and then the next thing we know, he's gone. And so he's not saying that he is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. He's simply saying, hey, he sort of resembles him because he doesn't have a genealogy either that we can read about, okay? So that's my argument. And I think the big idea here is the contrast in kingship between the kind of king that Melchizedek is and the kind of king that the king of Sodom is. And we have a little study here on what true kingship should look like. Remember back in Genesis 1, we were all created to be royalty. We're all sons and daughters of the king, and we were created to rule over the creation. But that creation became corrupt through sin. Kingship became corrupt through sin. But here is a picture of a truly righteous king, and he shines all the more against this very evil king, the king of Sodom, in this interaction here with Abram. Any thoughts? You're free to disagree with that, but I'm just giving you my opinion and what I believe from my study.
So doesn't like Daniel say in chapter 7 that he said he like saw someone like the Son of Man, and isn't that actually Jesus?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Isn't it basically the same language? He says, I saw someone like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. So is your reason, because this still says like the Son of Man, not straight up the Son of Man?
Yeah, I guess the difference is like the Son of Man. Son of Man is a terminology that means human being. And Jesus called himself Son of Man, right? He was the perfect human being. The writer of Hebrews uses like the Son of God. Okay, so that's where I would make the distinction. Even though Jesus is Son of Man, he's also Son of God. And it's that, I see your point here about how Daniel says like the Son of Man. So that's a good point that you make. I just think personally if you say that this is a pre-incarnate occurrence of Jesus, then you're saying this king isn't a real historic king. It sort of, in my opinion, pulls it out of the context here of the contrast being made between the two kings. But again, that's, I'm arguing my point of view, obviously, and you're free to see it differently with your study. So the other thing I want to point out is this emphasis on God Most High. Here we have another name, a description of who God is. He's the Most High God. In other words, there's no one greater than he is. The Hebrew word is El Elyon. We're going to see this again, and I'm going to put some of the names of God up on a slide. I think it's in tomorrow night's class. But I just want to draw your attention to that now. And here, Abram recognizes the God that Melchizedek worships, and he actually gives a tithe to Melchizedek, as we've said. And Abram says in verse 22, I have raised my hand to the Lord, that is to Yahweh, God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth. So Abram here identifies Yahweh with this God Most High, the greatest God, the highest God. Any other thoughts on this passage?
So we don't know anything about where this guy came from, right?
right?
Not really. In my opinion, he was a Canaanite king who ruled in Jerusalem. And it's interesting, we have the name of another Canaanite king when we get to the book of Judges. His name is Adonizedek. Notice Melchizedek and Adonizedek. And Adonizedek means the Lord is righteous, right? So this seems to be a name that was attached to a line of kings who reigned in Jerusalem before David conquered the city and captured it.
And where does he have learned about the God Most High?
Well, it's a good question. How did anyone learn, I suppose? I mean, Abram learned because God revealed himself to him. And either God revealed himself to Melchizedek, or maybe there was a line of people who continued to know and worship the true God, and Melchizedek was a product of that.
So contrary to that, it says that he was the priest of God. It doesn't say like a priest, it's like the only one.
Okay, so
you were saying sort of line of people that knew God. It maybe goes against that.
okay. Yeah,
As an individual.
because it says the instead of a.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Good argument. Anything else? Okay. Well, let's move on to Genesis 15, which will catch us up with where we hope to get to. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to put up this is the last slide we have, and I'm going to put up the outline for the entire chapter because I think it's important that you see what's going on here in the chapter. We have two divine encounters that Abram has with God in this chapter, okay? The first encounter involves the promise of seed or offspring to Abram. So God reveals himself. Abram complains and he says, "How do I know?" And then God confirms his promise to Abram concerning his offspring. And this is the passage, Blake, where he takes him out to see the stars of heaven and says, "Your descendants will be like the stars of the heavens." Then in the second half of the chapter, which is verses 7 through 21, we have the second divine encounter. And this encounter focuses on the land that God is going to give to Abram. So the first encounter focuses on the seed. The second encounter focuses on the land. And here it follows the same pattern. God reveals himself, makes promises. Abram complains and asks a question. And God reveals and confirms his promise. This section is obviously a little more lengthy, and we have an actual covenant ceremony at the end of this section where God makes a covenant with Abram. Okay, so that's where we're headed in this chapter. Let's begin by reading the first 6 verses. Aoife.
After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward." But Abram said, "Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus?" Then Abram said, "Look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir." Then he brought him outside and said, "Look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." And he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness.
Okay, great. So in verse 1, why do you suppose the Lord comes to Abram and says, "Do not be afraid, I am your shield and your exceedingly great reward"? What would Abram be afraid of, possibly?
Counterattack.
Sorry?
Counterattack.
A counterattack from
these kings that he just defeated in chapter 14. And so that word, I am your shield, would really fit that. In other words, I'm going to protect you, right? And then he goes on to say, I'm your exceedingly great reward. And that gives Abram an opportunity to say, okay, Lord, how are you going to work that out? Because I'm still childless. And, if God is going to reward Abram, it has to go beyond his own life. He has to have children to pass on the inheritance to. So he's saying, Lord, where are those children? And we don't know how much time has passed at this point, but quite clearly, Abram's been in the land now for a number of years, right? And so he's had these promises from God, but the years are going by and still no child. So if we put ourselves in his shoes, we can understand his struggle. And he's given up on Lot being his heir, if he ever thought Lot was, because now he's saying, this Eliezer of Damascus, the guy who was born in my house, right now, he's my heir. But God says in verse 4, this one will not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body. So this guarantees Abram, no, you're not going to be adopting anybody. It's going to be literal flesh and blood of yours who will be your heir. Luke, did you have a question?
Like you sort of related the shield back to the battle that just happened.
Yeah.
And then would you not maybe also tie the exceedingly great reward back to the fact that you didn't take anything from what they'd captured?
That's a really good point. Yeah, he refused to take any of that spoil of war. And so, yeah, God is saying not only that he's his shield, but he's his exceeding great reward. That's good. I like that. There's actually a word back in chapter 14 toward the end that uses this Hebrew word for shield, but I apologize because I've forgotten what that word is, but that ties it even more closely to the end of chapter 14. So to demonstrate the sincerity that God is going to fulfill his promise, verse 5, he gives Abram a sign. Okay, this isn't a miraculous sign. He just takes him outside and has him look at the stars and says, if you're able to count the stars, so shall your descendants be. And we have this great verse then in verse 6 that he believed the Lord and he accounted it to him for righteousness. And of course, this is a huge verse that Paul capitalizes on in the New Testament. He talks about both in Romans and Galatians about how righteousness is through faith. And simply because Abram believed, God accounted it to him for righteousness. You remember the original sin in the garden had to do with the fact that Eve doubted God's word and she doubted God's goodness. And so you can't have a healthy relationship if there's not trust. If you're always doubting what someone says, if you can't really believe what they say, you can't have a good relationship. And that's why faith is the way back to God. Faith is saying, God, I will take you at your word. I do believe that you want what's best for me. And when he takes Abram out and shows him the stars and Abram believes, that cements a relationship there between God and Abram. And God bestows then his righteousness upon Abram, his gift of righteousness, as Paul says. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, in verses 7 through 21, then we have the second divine encounter. And here it's, as I said, in regard to land. So, Blake.
7 through 21?
Yes, please.
And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other.
but he did not cut the birds in half. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. For I will bring judgment on the nations that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with the great possessions. As for you, you shall go on to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down, it was dark. Behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the land and the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.
Okay, thanks. So, verse 7, the Lord says to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. What does that language sound like? Like another statement in Scripture. I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans.
I've heard this similar when he's talking about bringing them out of Egypt.
Thank you. Yeah. I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, right? So very similar statement. Obviously, Abram came from Ur. He didn't come from Egypt, and that's why God says what he says. But this is an introduction. One of the things that God always does is he tells people what he's already done for them. Okay? And then, depending on the context, he may go on to pronounce a judgment if someone has sinned, or in this case, he's going on to pronounce more promises. I'm the same God who brought you out. Okay, I've done that for you, haven't I? Yes, Lord, you have. Okay, so now I'm going to make other promises to you, and you can be just as sure that I will keep those, just as I brought you up from Ur of the Chaldeans. And he says, I brought you up to give you this land. And Abram says, well, how do I know, Lord? And that's when the Lord institutes this little ceremony. So what's going on here with this ceremony?
It's God making a covenant with Abraham.
Okay, it's a covenant ceremony, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have all these sacrificial animals in verse 9. And by the way, they're all animals that later on in the law of Moses would be sacrificed to the Lord by the Israelites. Okay, so they're all clean animals, and they're all animals that would be brought to God as an offering. He tells Abram to cut them in two halves, right? Except for the birds, because the birds are smaller. And then we have this strange statement about how the vultures came down on the carcasses and Abram drove them away. What's that about? Any thoughts? Remember, the inspired authors, they don't waste any words. So,
it sounds like they are. Just a little fun fact for us.
Little fun fact.
It's just trying to show like Abram's like devotion to what obey God maybe.
It definitely shows that. What are the vultures? What would they maybe represent? In the ancient world, Luke, you've got thought?
I don't know, it's sort of almost, because it's like the offering to God, and then kind of be like Satan trying to spoil the work that Abram's doing before God blesses it.
Yeah, there you go. So the idea of this work that God is going to perform, which in this case is the making of a covenant, but these vultures represent evil, threatening these good promises. And it's sort of a foreshadowing of what God's going to tell Abram. Your descendants are going to be captives in a land that's not theirs for 400 years. It says this darkness and this terror falls on Abram as he has this vision as he's sleeping. And so the vultures and the darkness, they're all a sign of difficult times ahead and of how evil will continue to fight against the good promises of God. But God guarantees Abram that his descendants are going to be delivered and brought out, and that he will actually judge the nation who enslaved them. And of course, sitting on this side of things, we know exactly what this dream is all about, right? This is a prophecy about the coming slavery in Egypt and the Exodus during the time of Moses. So Abram's not going to experience any of this, however. In verse 15, he says, you'll go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. And then the reason God says, I'm not giving you this land right now is why. It's a very interesting reason.
This is the iniquity of the Amorites.
The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. What do you make of that? First of all, who are the Amorites?
I knew this question was coming. And I didn't know the answer.
You didn't know the answer. Well, hopefully we'll all know it by the time we leave class. The Amorites really, they're a Canaanite people, and sometimes the name Amorite is used in place of Canaanite. So it's kind of synonymous. So if it helps us, we could say the iniquity of the Canaanites is not yet complete. So what's going on here then?
They failed to get rid of them from the land. Because they failed to get rid of the land, they have to sort of brought down by them. So
I'm just having a hard time following what you're saying. Can you repeat it?
Because Jewish people were unsuccessful in ridding them from the promised land.
Yeah.
Then they suffered the punishment that sort of should have just been for the Canaanites almost.
That does happen later, but that's what God is saying here is, Abram, the reason I can't give you the land right now is because the iniquity of the Canaanites or the Amorites is not complete. Okay? So what's he saying?
Is he kind of giving them grace?
Exactly. This is a God of grace, right? And even though God could justify destroying the Canaanites with just one sin, and obviously they've done more than that, God is going to wait until in his time and wisdom, that cup is so full of sin that it's overflowing, so that no one can say that God is unjust in giving Abram's descendants the land. Okay? So this is a statement of mercy to the Canaanite peoples. And once again, it shows the character of God here. And then we have this interesting statement in verse 17 of God passing through the parts, appearing as a smoking oven and a burning torch. Does that make you think of anything? Smoking ovens and burning torches? Makes you think of Daniel? In what way?
When the guys are put
In the fiery furnace?
yeah.
Okay.
That's just what I thought of.
Okay. Yeah, because you have a fire and you have a furnace, right? So, okay. I'm thinking something a little more immediate. It's in the future, but not that far in the future.
We see like the tabernacle or the temple.
Or like the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud that guided the Israelites in the wilderness. So, I mean, we're talking here about the Exodus, aren't we? In this dream or vision that Abram has, his people are going to be enslaved for 400 years, and then God's going to bring them out. So this smoking oven and flaming torch might be a representation of the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud that follows Israel through the wilderness. And anyway, it's a representation of God, whatever it is. And it is God who passes between the parts of the animals. Now, what do we know about this particular ceremony? Anything? What's the significance of God passing through these parts, Blake? Oh, okay, sorry, I thought you had your hand up. Yeah, Luke.
You should, both people who the covenant be made with pass through, but it's just God, so that he is the one who fulfilled that, and Abraham just received the blessing.
Right. Okay, so first of all, it's interesting that it's not both God and Abram passing through the parts, it's just God. So God is taking these promises fully on his own without asking Abram to pass through them. There's a passage in Jeremiah that talks about people making a covenant and passing between the parts of the animal. And the idea there is that if we don't keep our promises in the covenant, may we be like these animals who've been dead and divided. Okay, so most scholars think that that's what's going on here, that God is taking part in a similar kind of covenant ceremony and taking all of the promises on his shoulders. It's a way of assuring Abram that he's going to do what he says. And then, as God does that, he gives the boundaries of the promised land in verses 18 through 21. And if you remember the map I had up there earlier of Solomon's kingdom, this is the dimensions of the kingdom of Solomon, but the only time that Israel actually reached these dimensions that are promised here to Abram. Okay, you got any other thoughts here on these last verses 7 through 21? So we saw God make a covenant with Noah. Now we're seeing God making a covenant with Abram. And we're going to read more about that when we get to chapter 17 tomorrow night. Okay? All right, long day for you guys, so God bless you. Tomorrow night we'll do 16, 17, 18, and 19. So 16 through 19, okay? See you then. Have a good night. You're welcome.